Spookocracy. A suggested anti-word spell defense. Bruce Charlton. The terminology of totalitarian evil takes many forms, one aim of which is to enmesh our consciousness in word spells conducive to the evil strategy of subversion, corruption, destruction and inversion. Literally all of the litmus test issues, great and small, have used positively inflected tendentious terminologies that beg questions in their own favor, only the latest of which is artificial intelligence. The same intelligence term crops up in the names and descriptors of the surveillance and manipulation institutions, and their role in the totalitarian systems of Western nations and globalist organizations. As an act of inner, and sometimes public resistance, a counterspell, if you like, directed against the manipulative aspects of this term, I suggest that spookocracy can be substituted and/or adapted to all relevant and associated institutional manifestations. Which term has the needful negative connotations, including essential malignity, an unnecessary and parasitic existence, elements of bluff, and a kind of spectral half-alive/undead quality. Neo-pagans, and modern pagans, are guilty of extreme double standards with respect to Christianity. Bruce Charlton. I have read a great deal of modern pagan, and/or neo-pagan writings, and have some acquaintance with such people. Indeed at one time, for several years and some 20 years ago plus, that is what I might well have called myself. This movement is, unfortunately, permeated and motivated by a resentment against Christianity that ranges from cold contempt to burning indignation, a phenomenon that leads to the deep and perception-structuring bias I have termed anything but Christianity. I have recently been exploring some different and new, to me, avenues and individuals within the neo-pagan world, and was again struck by this structuring bias. This anti-Christianity is expressed so strongly that one would suppose that the writers and speakers had been brought up in either a medieval theocracy or the Puritan Geneva of Calvin, or, often, some unholy combination of the two. Instead of actually having been raised in one of the overwhelmingly atheist materialist nations of the West, during the 1940s, 50s, or 60s. Furthermore, this is combined with depictions of the pagan past so fantastically wishful that they seem to have derived from Pollyanna wearing rose-tinted spectacles in Disneyland. Anything and everything bad in reports of the pagan past is ascribed to spiteful Christian misrepresentation, anything and everything good about past Christian societies is attributed to residual paganism. What seems to be happening is that these folk are approaching paganism from within themselves, in a creative spirit directed at individual participation. While simultaneously regarding and representing Christianity in the most literal, institutional, external terms, focusing on sometimes real but worst-case scenarios of tyranny, cruelty and atrocity, and making their definitions and descriptions of Christianity citing the most childish and/or obviously manipulative time, places and sources. They subjectively engage with paganism in highly positively selective, personal and optimistic fashion, while adopting a detached, cynical and condemnatory attitude to negatively selective, cut-and-dried, Christianity. While this is very, very obvious to me, especially given my history, almost by definition there is no persuading against such attitudes, which are common to much of modern life, and which pagans share with the mainstream of atheist materialists. Yet it is atheist materialists who run this world and have done so for many decades, and atheist materialists therefore are, or ought to be, the real spiritual enemies of sincere pagans. In other words, by their revealed preferences and their ludicrous insistence on fighting dead battles and wars that Christianity lost long ago, pagans, despite any counter-protestations, are actually of the left and of the mainstream. Pagans indeed share the characteristically and definitively left fundamental concern with this worldly hedonism and therapy, i.e. seeking personal pleasures and happiness here and now, alleviating personal miseries and suffering, justified by a utilitarian altruistic ideology of making this world a better place. What I eventually did, and would suggest to others, is that they instead approach Christianity in something of the same positive, subjective and engaged spirit with which they approach paganism, which ought to be a spirit of discovery and creativity. Authentic altruism is impossible, love between concrete beings is not. Francis Berger. A short time ago, I commented on a quote by Mario Gramsci, a Marxist thinker and politician who died in Mussolini's jails before the outbreak of the Second World War. Although I know little about Gramsci, he strikes me as the sort of 20th century figure who convinced himself that he was striving to make the world a better place for other people, all without the inconvenience of actually caring all that much about or genuinely loving other people. Put another way, Gramsci strikes me as a typical 20th century sham altruist who doggedly maintained that he was dedicated to the collective without really loving or caring about anyone, not even those close to him. In his prison diaries, Gramsci notes,
"How many times have I wondered if it is really possible to forge links with a mass of people when one has never had strong feelings for anyone, not even one's own parents, if it is possible to have a collectivity when one has not been deeply loved oneself by individual human creatures. Hasn't this had some effect on my life as a militant? Has it not tended to make me sterile and reduce my quality as a revolutionary by making everything a matter of pure intellect, of pure mathematical calculation?"
Gramsci essentially answers his own question in the above. No, it is not really possible to forge links with a mass of people, particularly not when one has never had strong feelings for anyone, not even one's own parents, nor felt loved oneself. The attempt to forge links with a mass of people dissolves into abstraction, into a matter of pure intellect, pure mathematical calculation. Moreover, it would make little difference if one did experience strong feelings for individuals, yet still allowed oneself to be lulled into believing in the superiority of loving the masses more than one's concrete relationships. Here's my thinking on the matter, revisiting some earlier notions on the subject. Forming loving relationships that can potentially extend into eternity is an overarching purpose of divine creation. Altruism is a perverted, misguided attempt to fulfill that purpose. On the one hand, altruism is likely extremely detrimental to the true self because it tends to activate and amplify false selves, thereby driving the true self further from consciousness. On the other hand, altruism's insistence that we place the other above the self forces us away from reality into abstraction. The false selves that fan altruism may be false, but false is not the same as non-existent. Thus, most effective altruism boils down to false selves insincerely placing other false selves above them. However, even our false selves abhor the abstract void that is the other, but they tolerate it if it can provide egoistic benefits. On the whole matter of the other, it seems that the only way an individual can establish and maintain contact with the other is if they internalize otherness within themselves. Thus, altruism does not boil down to the matter of selves placing the other above themselves, it exists in the non-relationship of others, of one's internalized abstract other contacting an externalized abstract other. Put another way, altruism is the non-relationships of non-existent entities. The internal other is not just another false self, it is the denial of all selves, especially the true self. The same applies to external other. Altruism, then, amounts to little more than a void sacrificing itself for a void. The principle of concern for the nothing and non-existence of the other and placing that above one's own other, one's own nothing and non-existence, all for the benefit of nothing and non-existence. The magic of analog electronic technology. Bruce Charlton. There was a magic to analog technology that is objectively absent from the digital. As an obvious example, that many discovered from themselves after many years of denial, an analog recorded vinyl LP record captures that which is recorded in a more complete and emotionally engaging fashion than does a digitally recorded CD. Similarly, the old dial-tuned radio sets, shortwave/medium wave/long wave, had a magical quality about them, for those susceptible to such enchantment, something that was almost independent of whatever was being listened to. An indelible and evocative memory of my early teen years was playing with the switches and dials of my black, vinyl-cased Philips transistor radio with earplug while lying on or in bed, just prior to sleep. It had to be night, because at night, the atmospheric conditions favored long-distance transmission of radio signals. What I most remember was scanning the short-wave and long-wave bands, seeking foreign voices from unknown places. For some reason, I most liked to listen to German speakers, although what I assumed to be Russian was also an exotic attraction, bringing a frisson that the authorities would disapprove, and I probably ought not to be listening to it. Sometimes, somehow, messages would drift across the Atlantic, and I might hear snatches of American or Canadian accents. Some things don't change, and now the UK blocks digital media from that nation. It was a further advantage of analog radio that such top-down control could not easily be achieved. With shortwave, there was the phenomenon of the signal waxing and waning, so that I would hear a snatch of speaking, then it would fade, and I could almost never find that same source twice. With long wave there was a steady signal, but a lot of background interference. I was also fascinated by the strange sounds, sometimes high-pitched and Morse code-like. But I especially liked a low-pitched buzzing that was modulating in its quality, because someone had once told me that one such sound, on the SW frequency, was the planet Jupiter. This was not necessarily completely fanciful. I was forever half listening for this particular sound, and if I found it, or something sufficiently similar, I would listen for minutes, as if trying to understand what the planet was telling me or the world. And, such is the nature of these things that I would always forget where on the dial I had found this Jupiter sound, so I couldn't ever go back again the next night, but would have to start my search afresh. Something about the simpler analog technology made this experience possible, partly because the dodgy quality of the audio created space for the imagination, but partly also because the experience was very direct. The signal made hundreds or thousands of miles away, came directly to the little device in my bed, maybe bouncing off the ionosphere en route. So there was an almost person-to-person quality in the experience. And the wave movements generated by the person speaking into a microphone were translated into the movements of the diaphragm in my earpiece, again in a very direct fashion. I never had a crystal set radio of my own, and they were unsuited to bedtime, under blankets, usage, but these were even simpler, more miraculous and magical than my little transistor radio, because they did not even require a battery. Somehow, the power of the radio waves, generated so far away, and sleeting through us all of the time, was by itself and without an amplifier, enough to move the diaphragm when intercepted by the diode. It strikes me that all this stuff could be elaborated into a metaphor for what has changed and been lost over the past 50+ years, a microcosm of societal and technological change and its effect on the human imagination, but I shall leave that to you. Note, a few years ago, I got another small analog radio with a variety of SW bands, but this doesn't seem to work as it once did. Almost everything is drowned in crackles, perhaps due to interference from the many electronic devices, light bulbs, etc. around the house, and indeed everywhere else. Where once we had faint but meaningful voices, we now have a choice between curated and processed digital media, or electromagnetic chaos. Further note, a friend of my father's, a dentist, was a radio ham. He had his own radio transmitter in an office at home, and a personal 50-foot aerial outside the house, plus the requisite official permissions needed for these. We visited one afternoon, and he demonstrated the equipment, and how he could converse with other hams around the world. I found the whole thing intensely exciting, and firmly resolved to do the same myself as soon as could afford the kit. But, of course, never did. 2 prevalent errors about death, one materialist, the other spiritual. Bruce Charlton. The mainstream and official modern view about death is that it is the complete annihilation of the person, after which nothing of that person remains. That is one prevalent error about death, it is the error of materialistic atheism. The other prevalent error is spiritual. It acknowledges that biological death of the body is not a complete end but that something of the person continues, and it concludes that therefore to the enlightened mind death is not really significant. This error states that any negative anticipation or attitudes, anything like fear, horror, or a sense of tragedy and loss, that people commonly feel concerning death, is based on misunderstanding. The erroneous assertion is that one who really understands death, does not regard death as important, it is just like going to sleep, passing through a door, just another great adventure, moving to a higher level. The spiritual error about death seems less obviously an error in the sense that it recognizes what humankind always has recognized, until very recently, and among a minority, that death is not the end of everything. But this recognition has a double negative form: death is 1. Not 2. The end. So of itself this does not move us towards a better understanding. The spiritual error is an error because it is an explaining away, a denial of another universally recognized truth. That universally recognized truth is that a human death is significant, and indeed represents some kind of a tragedy. The spiritual error is in arguing that because death is followed by something better therefore we ought not to be sad about it. The error is in the therefore because this is a non sequitur, it does not follow. The world changes, we grow up and apart, children grow up and apart, all these may be inevitable and potentially good, but they are also sad, rightly sad. It is an impairment of sensibility if we cannot experience that sadness. Such things, including death, are indeed tragic partly because they are inevitable, and especially when the change is overall good. It is tragic that overall good is attained only at the cost of particular loss and sadness. Mortal death is therefore significant, and rightly regarded as tragic, even when it is followed by something overall better, even when death is followed by resurrected eternal life in heaven. And this is explicit in the 4th Gospel, which is all about the new hope Jesus has made possible, of eternal resurrected heavenly life, but the sadness, the tragedy of death, whether of Lazarus, Jesus wept, or the impending death of Jesus himself, is explicitly, as well as by the structure of the narrative, treated with full tragic significance. Jesus knows that he will be resurrected and attain salvation, as did Lazarus, but he is still saddened and grieved by the losses involved in death. So, let Christians avoid both of the false extremes of arguing, either materially, that death is an end to everything, or spiritually, that death is insignificant in the scheme of things. Note, I am saying here that, for all Socrates' genuine nobility during his death, as recorded by Plato in Phaedo, the attitude he taught concerning death was erroneous. Why entropy is inevitable in this mortal incarnate life. Bruce Charlton. Why is entropy inevitable, unavoidable in this mortal incarnate life? The answer is because, in this transitional phase between a purely spirit premortal life, and resurrected eternal incarnated life in heaven, our bodies are made from the substance of other beings. Because ultimately there are only beings. Because these beings are eternal, the materials from which our bodies are made are only lent us, for a while, by other beings. Therefore we incarnate by a contingent, always changing, inevitably temporary, alliance of beings. There are no inert minerals, all chemicals are actually parts of beings. And of course there are actual beings incorporated into our bodies, such as many individual cells. For example, the phagocyte white blood cells are essentially autonomous amoebae. But these, and other cells, exist in a dynamic kind of symbiosis, living and reproducing in the environment provided by our blood. Temporarily, controlled by our regulatory systems, which also include other beings and parts of beings. So, the innate tendency with time, is for the allied beings and parts of beings to revert to the purposes of the beings themselves. In other words, for these other beings, from whom our bodies are made, to become autonomous agents with a divine destiny, at some point they must regain that primary agency which has been temporarily suspended in forming our bodies. In this primary or first creation that we all inhabit, the ultimate identity of beings has not changed, even when one being nine or some part of a being, is being used by another. This is why entropy is a part of the primary creation, inevitable, unavoidable. And this is why Jesus Christ was necessary to create a form of incarnated existence without entropy, without death. We can understand that resurrection entails a recreation of our incarnate selves, purely from our own beings. And therefore without a tendency for the components to revert to other beings. And therefore we, because of the second creation of Jesus Christ, may choose life everlasting, without the entropy and death which are intrinsic to this primary creation. A creation formed by the eternal commitment of whole beings to live in harmony, by love. Earthly utopias always fail. William Wildblood. The attempt to live on earth as though you were already in heaven inevitably leads to disaster, and communities that try to do this always collapse. No exceptions. They may have good intentions, but they are naive and lack wisdom. The world of man is innately corrupt. It is a fallen world marked by sin, ignorance, greed, desire, fear, conflict and death, and any attempt to regulate this world must take those into account. You cannot pretend they are not there even in the best and smoothest running of worldly societies. You shouldn't go too far the other way and think everything is wicked and evil, but you have to acknowledge the reality of evil, and its presence in every human heart. Like it or not, that is the truth. Earth is not heaven, and natural man cannot function on the same principles as spiritual man. He should certainly aspire to love but cannot pretend love is already there, because it just is not, which is why all earthly societies, even the most spiritually attuned, must accept that sin is ever present in some form and degree. Hence, there must always be law and a measure of force to preserve order and peace. Idealistic souls, doves, may recoil from this, but the wise, serpents, know it is so. We are called to be both doves and serpents at the same time. Either one on its own leads to illusion. In fact, either one on its own is not even real from the spiritual perspective, being a worldly human imitation of a real spiritual quality, because on the spiritual level each of necessity includes the other. It is only when the mind is separated from the soul that love and truth appear distinct. The reality of this world is entropy and death. That is why it is futile to attempt to establish a heavenly kingdom here. At the same time, The flaws of this world make it a good environment for learning, which, after all, is its function and the reason for our appearance here. Heaven is perfection, but this world can never be perfect. We can and should try to live as best we can. We should try to build societies and cultures that approximate to the higher worlds, but heaven is only heaven because its denizens are completely purified of sin, and that is not possible in this world. Earthly utopias inevitably become performative because they are built from the outside, seeking to establish perfection through regulation rather than manifesting it from within. As such, their inner inconsistencies and inability to sustain the vision will always tear them apart. The attempt to enforce heaven is more likely to create hell, and that is what the history of such endeavors demonstrates over and over again. What do I think about X? Excuse me, I'll just ask. Bruce Charlton. The idea that what we think, believe, do, ought to be derived from some external authority, which is, in practice, always some institution/organization/corporation. Some formal group of people, is something that we recognize in others, but seldom acknowledge in ourselves. I had a friend who had recently become a member, or some kind of associate, of the UK Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party, and he described to me how things worked there, ideologically. Whenever there was some big new news story, an invasion, an economic crisis, a strike, civil disorder, a meeting would be called at which the event was ideologically framed and explained, and members were told how the party could make use of it, therefore what to think and do about it. This is how communists work, and this has been well known and obvious to others, whenever any argument with them is attempted. It is why communists can and do, in lockstep, make 180-degree turns of policy as required by part expediency, as when Hitler made a pact with Stalin, then again when Germany invaded the USSR. In 2020 there were several such 180-degree no then yes instant turns, whether testing was needed, whether masking was needed, was Christmas to be cancelled. Analysis, debate, argument was futile, what was false, wicked, unnecessary yesterday, becomes true, good and compulsory today, and this is all rational, consistent and absolutely necessary. When authority lies with an institution, so does truth and legitimacy, so there are no valid grounds for dissent. There is only either obedience, or just punishment. This is also, by somewhat different procedures, how churches work when they are powerful in the lives of people. This fundamental identity of control procedures is one reason why people, mistakenly, assume that ideology and religion are the same thing, and that totalitarianism and theocracy are fundamentally identical. When some new thing emerges for which the church view is not immediately obvious, there is some mechanism by which the church's framing, explanation and instructions are handed down. Because the church is the essential and only mediator of the divine, it is the ultimate repository of truth, beauty and virtue, so that all anyone absolutely needs to know is what the church thinks, and then to obey it. Out with which there is nothing but selfish, sin-rooted, individual will. This model of institutional authority represents a worldview, a mode of consciousness, for which the ultimate responsibility for important attitudes, beliefs and behaviors lies in some external and formal social grouping. It was, apparently, not always and everywhere thus, but it has been thus for recorded history, with ultimate authority variously, but always externally and institutionally, located. The job of each individual in such a system is to internalize as much as possible of the approved views and ways of reasoning that characterize that social institution there, and then given custody of his conscience, and when the answer is not obvious, to seek and follow appropriate guidance. Such an external authority-based setup dictates the role of intellectuals in terms of the social institution. The job of an intellectual in this scheme is that of a commissar, to learn, defend, and transmit the institutional view. When there is dissent or opposition to the institutional view, the job of the intellectual is overcome it, by whatever means he can, by whatever means are effective, while staying within the institutionally ratified assumptions, evidences and methods. The point is that the intellectual's own thinking is in service of this task. He will not think in any way that might lead to another conclusion than that of the institution he serves. This is why institution-serving individuals will never, under any circumstances, acknowledge or even discuss their fundamental, including metaphysical, assumptions. They will only and always operate from those assumptions. They will only assume the rightness of the institution they serve. This is the cause of a feeling we must all have experienced, must all have come up against, even if our own thinking is in service to a church or other societal institution. Perhaps the most usual encounter to evoke this feeling is with a bureaucrat who is trying to enforce the institutional will upon us, trying to get us into line with the current strategies and priorities and behaviors. We may be lured into defending our case for dissent or disobedience, or inadequate enthusiasm, or arguing against the institutional POV, but we will realize, later if not sooner, that we are just talking into sand. Our interlocutor is not interested in what we think, not interested in the validity of our arguments. He already knows what we are supposed to think and do. His only interest in our arguments is to refute them using institution-approved arguments, to bring our views into line with institutional views. Or else to discredit our perspective, usually by discrediting us. Most of the people, most of the time, behave in this way, in all walks of life. It might be most obvious in political ideologies, churches and bureaucracies, but it is the same everywhere nowadays, including the areas I worked in, medicine, academia, teaching, and science. This is proximately because in modern life all social institutions have become primarily bureaucratic, and all bureaucracies are linked to, and indeed form, the global totalitarian system. But it is also because many people, and nearly all intellectuals in particular, regard ultimate authority as residing in some social institution such as their ideology, or employer, or their church, or the system, and see their ultimate job to be defending and propagating that institutional authority. This reality is what underpins and causes the futility of argument, here and now. Most argument that we encounter in the media and professionally, is between individuals representing institutions. The main exception to this commissar-like situation, is when individuals are more or less psychopathic, when they are selfish, self-seeking, short-termist, and are using institutional camouflage, faked attitudes and assumptions, subverted/inverted procedures etc., to pursue to their own personal agenda, seeking wealth, sex, power, fame, admiration, or whatever turns them on. Anyone who is seeking spiritual truth, trying to understand his own situation in this world and larger reality, anyone who seeks a religion and a way of living, will come up against this commissar or bureaucratic externalization of authority. In effect, the seeker is supposed to strive for a situation in which he accepts the external authority of one church or another. In practice, this means that the seeker is supposed to accept some external authority, for example the truth and validity of Church X, as the first step, from which all else follows. Because once a particular external institution is accepted as the fount of authority, validity, goodness and correct procedure, then the seeker can, and is expected to, hand over his conscience and honesty to that institution. From then on, his ultimate role in life, or at least the role that dictates what counts as ultimate, is to himself learn, defend, and transmit the institutional view. It is difficult, it may be impossible, For any individual to find anyone who will engage on any other basis than that of first accepting, or being rhetorically duped into accepting, the primacy of some external authority, some denomination, church or other institution. Life becomes a choice between actually existing social institutions. Duty becomes a matter of serving the chosen institution. And if you are not happy about this situation, you will probably have no alternative but to accept responsibility for yourself. You can then expect to be attacked by everyone who serves any institution, i.e. almost everybody. But in a totalitarian bureaucratic world where all social institutions are orientated towards evil, this path of personal responsibility is the only alternative to serving one or another, or several, organizations assimilated to the demonic agenda. Your real choice is between serving overall evil body, heart, and soul, or seeking a direct and personal knowledge of and relationship with something better. Mistakenly, because when religion is sincere, it is regarded by adherents as being ultimately spiritual, and underpinned by the divine. This makes a difference. The question is how much difference, and in what ways different. The difference may be so feeble as to be ineffectual, the ways of difference may be for worse, as well as for better. Information saturation has proven more effective than information banning. Francis Berger. My 14-year-old son recently began reading Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, a novel I was very fond of when I was his age. If memory serves me well, Bradbury's tale of book-burning firemen served as the gateway to what became a mini-obsession with dystopian fiction during my early teen years. At that time, and for a long time afterward, I was thoroughly convinced that totalitarian power structures depended largely on their ability to control and censor information. Put another way, totalitarianism could only exist if and when it had obliterated and outlawed all information that threatened its own narrative. The practices of past totalitarian societies, the National Socialist Kulturkampf for Soviet oppression, lent great support to this conviction. Like most in the West, during the Cold War years, I firmly believed that personal, spiritual, and societal freedom depended almost entirely on the free flow of information. Take that away, and totalitarianism of one form or another was guaranteed to follow. I no longer subscribe to such views. On the contrary, current circumstances in the West have revealed that totalitarianism can establish itself quite effectively without obstructing or interfering with the free flow of information all that much. Yes, censorship, bans, and witch hunts have occurred and still flare up occasionally. However, when it comes to information, the situation in the West today bears little resemblance to the hardcore repressive regimes of the 20th century or those depicted by the likes of Bradbury or Orwell. Instead of banning and destroying information, our present-day totalitarians saturate the world with it. Although it officially frowns upon and, in some cases, prohibits and sanctions certain books, texts, and information sources that go against its narratives, the current totalitarian power structures in the West allow access to such books, texts, and sources, provided the individual is willing to do the legwork to attain such knowledge. A motivated individual in the West can find any book, text, or article written by anyone at any time without too much effort or interference and, notably, often without having to pay for it, which is an entirely different utopia than the ones depicted in the most famous dystopian novels. That should provide a pause for thought. Present-day totalitarianism does not seem to fear secondary thinking in the same way its predecessors had. If it did, it would not permit the vast oceans of information sloshing around the world. Being able to access information that unmistakably reveals the corruption and evil of the current system has little to no effect on its power structures, operations, and functioning. On the contrary, subversive information usually serves to feed the system in some manner. More often than not, it seems to strengthen rather than weaken it. Our current totalitarian world not only tolerates information, but it also actively promotes its proliferation and dissemination, the point of what can only be described as information overload. I am of the conviction that this active promotion of information overload stems from nefarious spiritual motivations. The alienation of modern man represents near total submersion in the representational world, made all the more acute by the ever-increasing disconnect between reality and representations of reality. This disconnection marks the virtual obliteration of primary thinking in favor of secondary thinking. Put another way, for modern man, secondary thinking via externally received symbolic information is reality because he is virtually incapable of connecting with reality in any other way. Modern man now regards the symbols, language, and other representations used to shape, fashion, give form to, or describe as reality itself, both de facto, as in matter of fact, and de jure, as in legally and officially recognized. Simply put, information used solely at the level of secondary thinking is now synonymous with reality. The war we are in is fundamentally a spiritual war, not an information war. Many recognize and understand the totalitarian push to control the narrative, however, they fail to discern that the core problem is the exclusive and obsessive focus on engaging with narrative through secondary thinking, thereby keeping consciousness firmly entrenched in representational reality as reality, or, in keeping consciousness locked in the information age and its related thinking. Our present-day totalitarians are not simply striving to control information and secondary thinking, they want to ensure human consciousness remains trapped in a state of information overload and secondary thinking. I suspect that at the deepest, most fundamental level, our totalitarian rulers and the demonic forces they serve welcome information opposition to their secondary level information manipulations because it keeps human consciousness firmly fixated on representations as reality rather than on reality. Thus, keeping people engaged in information wars not only helps to distract from the spiritual war but also helps to hinder the further development of human consciousness. Winning the spiritual war and connecting with truth and reality does not and cannot boil down to being informed, an essentially passive state in which one allows the external to shape, fashion, give shape to, and teach reality via representations presented and accepted as reality. I am not implying that the representational is dispensable. On the contrary, it is vital, but only when we understand that it serves as a go-between and not a final destination. In this sense, the representations the good info warriors provide are far superior to the information promulgated by the likes of the World Economic Forum, which serves more as a go-nowhere rather than a go-between. Yet representations on the side of good can only do good if they are treated as intermediaries, that is, used to orient and/or connect to reality. That connection to reality happens beyond the representational, in the realm of primary thinking, the realm of non-representational direct knowing originating from and connecting to the primal self. Although representational, secondary thinking can inspire, motivate, and guide individuals toward primary thinking, it cannot substitute for primary thinking. Present-day totalitarianism does not fear information, it fears thinking, especially the primary kind. Note, some of the above is a rehashing of previous thoughts on secondary thinking. Was Jesus mainly providing information and teaching, or was Jesus a new creator? Bruce Charlton. One of the major difficulties that Christians now have is in trying to explain clearly, simply, concisely, who Jesus was, what Jesus did, and, in particular, why Jesus was indispensable. I.e., indispensable to those who want what Jesus offers. Jesus might be conceptualized in two main ways, either as someone who was a teacher and preacher of the truth, or as a creator who changed the universe, and thereby the possibilities for men. Information. Historically, Jesus has been regarded mainly as a teacher and preacher who provided information. This information was also backed up by divine power, but the main thing, people assumed, was the information. In order that this information be learned, understood, and acted upon in future generations, it was assumed that Jesus constituted a church. Naturally, several/many have claimed to be the church that Jesus intended. In some, to varying degrees and in various ways, the true information derived from Jesus and provided by this church would be backed up by divine power. The church's essential job was to discover, preserve, develop the information from Jesus, then to disseminate it, persuade people of its validity, make and enforce rules of conduct derived from this information. Ultimately, the church would supervise construction of a human society that embodied, was built upon, the information provided by Jesus. The essential nature of Jesus was therefore bound to the essential nature of the church that was the true repository of the information that Jesus provided. That is, Jesus was essential because of his information, therefore Jesus was essential insofar as the church was essential to the knowledge, understanding, implementation etc. of this information. Creation. I suggest an alternative understanding of what Jesus did is that he was a new divine creator. New because Jesus did not exist as a divine man before his incarnation on earth, and divine because he was creating additional possibilities, he was creating an extension to pre-existing creation. Primary divine creation already existed before Jesus, and Jesus was born into this creation and became divine in the context of that first creation. What Jesus did, the primary thing, was to make possible a different future, a new option, than was possible before Jesus. This, I believe, is the truth about Jesus. It is the proper primary conceptualization of who he was and what he did, and its consequences. But this, I would say true, way of understanding Jesus as a new creator of new possibilities is blocked by theological philosophical assumptions, which were actually preconceptions, i.e. they were pre-Jesus ways of understanding, which have been, I believe, retroactively imposed upon who Jesus was and what Jesus did. For instance, Jesus' nature as a divine man, incarnated into mortal life on earth, who creatively transformed the possibilities of existence from his life onwards, was obscured and rendered incoherent by also insisting that Jesus, the one God, who was eternal, omniscient, omnipotent and unchangeable, impassible. Nobody can explain, clearly, simply, concisely, how Jesus can be a mortal incarnate man, and also the one God, therefore this is made a mystery. So the person trying to understand why and how this man Jesus who lived and dies 2000 years ago is necessary to salvation now, is immediately told, it's a mystery. Not a good start, I suggest. The fact that therefore Jesus made a necessary difference, did something new, brought something to the world that did not exist before the time of Jesus, was terminally confused by insisting that Jesus was always the one God, from eternity, from forever before his birth/life/death/ascension, and, because of his omni-attributes, Jesus operated outside of time. Such that Jesus somehow always was, as well as always is, and always shall be. Such that the explanatory sequence of creation before Jesus and then creation after Jesus, was said to be ultimately a kind of mortal and earthly illusion. Because in real reality, outside of time/where time is not, where the one God, including Jesus, existed, creation just was, eternally and perfect. So the understanding of Jesus as a new creator that I regard to be true, was and is theologically regarded as false by prior philosophical assumption, because it was assumed that could be no ultimate change in creation, neither before nor after, no addition to creation. After all, how could Jesus add to or improve something that was already and forever perfect? The consequences include that Jesus is nowadays, almost universally, among self-identified Christians as well as not, regarded as primarily a teacher, preacher, prophet. Jesus is seen as a provider of information. Christian debate therefore focuses mainly on the information, on the validity of its sources, whether the sources are being understood accurately, whether or what difference is made by societal changes, and the various claims by churches or secular experts over the authority to decide these matters of information. Among self-identified Christians, debate also concerns the nature and scope of that divine power which, it is envisaged, backs up and pushes the information. Questions such as, what does God really want to happen to us? Will reform be imposed, or perhaps our destruction? Is the divine power restricted to a particular church, or particular parts of the earthly institutional instantiation of the church? Does divine power to impose information apply to all humans in the same way? Is divine power irresistible by humans, or does it depend on voluntary human cooperation? Questions regarding church authority, how it arose and how it was preserved and transmitted across many generations. Such are the kinds of questions that concern many self-identified Christians, questions of information. Alternatively, it seems to me that when Jesus is understood as a divine man whose work was essentially that of creator operating in sequential time, the story and sequence become clearer and easier to understand, and explain. It is realized that for Jesus the teaching and preaching and prophecy were an optional extra, information was secondary to his main work and achievement. In an ultimate sense, when understood as a creator, if Jesus had lived and died in utter obscurity, and left no records or memories in earthly society, then his essential work of creation could still have been accomplished. The new created possibilities Jesus made, would still exist, and would still be available to all who desired them. Aside from the fact that modern men have been trained, multi-generationally, to find the claims of religion incredible and ridiculous, while uncritically gulping down endless drafts of incoherent/self-contradicting nonsense from the establishment media conduit. I is anti-personal and anti-spiritual, as such, it can offer no real positives. Francis Berger. Despite everything, some self-professed Christians continue to publicly laud the merits of AI, claiming it will make people smarter, more efficient, creative, and wealthy, provided it is utilized effectively with good underlying motivations. Ridiculous hype and exaggerated claims aside, AI has revealed itself as the most anti-personal and anti-spiritual technology ever developed. As such, it is immune to good underlying motivations and cannot be utilized effectively for any good purpose. Thus, the perceived positives AI appears to offer are head fakes, spiritual deceptions, through and through. Unfortunately, there's not much that can be done for those who fail to recognize this. At best, they will learn the hard way, at worst, they will convince themselves that AI has indeed made them smarter, more efficient, creative, wealthy, or whatever and embrace such fake positives as proof of their sagacity. Instrumental attitudes and spiritual contact with the dead. Bruce Charlton. By instrumental I mean making use of, so that having an instrumental attitude to somebody means making use of him. By the dead I mean those who have mortally died, biologically died. By spiritual contact with the dead, I refer to the fact that we, naturally and spontaneously, have spiritual contact with some of those we love, or with whom we have some other love-rooted relationship such as ancestors, and who have died. The real possibility of spiritual contact with the dead is not something that requires proof or argument. It is spontaneous and regarded natural and inevitable for human beings in most places and through most of history. Indeed, spiritual contact with the dead only wholly absent when a person has decided that it is impossible. Here and now, typically, because so many people have inculcated the weird, incoherent and self-destructive socialization of modern atheistic materialism. But starting from this weird spiritual materialism we moderns inhabit, it is a valid question concerning just how we may resume our natural birthright of loving interaction with some of the dead. How to attain contact with the dead turns out to be very much affected by our attitudes and intentions for that relationship. The whole matter of contact with the dead is very badly muddied and distorted by instrumental attitudes. In other words, many people seek contact with the dead in order to gain something from the relationship. And we ought to recognize the wrongness of such a motivation. We do recognize this wrongness in the material life of our mortal waking state. We recognize that to seek friendship in order to get something from somebody, is not friendship at all, but is simply making use of somebody, exploiting, or at least making a convenience of, another person. Such friendship is not friendship at all, it is attempted deception and manipulation. Why, then, do people so often have exactly this motivation when it comes to seeking contact or maintaining relationships with the dead? So often these spiritual relationships are sought in order for the living person to get something from a dead spirit, at the least to get instruction, teaching or information, knowledge of some kind useful to the living party, or even to get power, as when black magicians seek to enslave and use spirits. There are plenty of examples of people who claim relationship with some deceased person as a way of claiming personal prestige and authority, as a way of validating their work or teachings. For instance, to seek contact with the dead in a spirit of serving some supposed destiny. Maybe the living party seeks to serve, perhaps channel, the spirit of the dead person, to extend or to finish their work on earth. But this intent to serve is at root another species of instrumental motivation, and may well open the living person to manipulation by malign dead spirits who seek to corrupt and exploit the living for their own purposes. My point is that none of this is a good basis for seeking a relationship with the dead. The proper basis is surely love. The same as our living ideals of family, spousal or friendship love. A loving relationship in this mortal life is the highest, perhaps the only genuinely high, form of relationship, and so it should be in relationships between mortally living and dead. The proper initial aim in seeking relationships with one of the dead, ought to be rooted in a particular and personal affection, and ultimately aim to have a relationship of participation, of sharing. Therefore we should not aim at a functional relationship, not have an aim of achieving fulfillment of some plan, not doing something. I think the reason that the claims for relationships with the dead are so incoherent, so riddled with self-deception and self-seeking, is this matter of the attitude with which they are sought and maintained. This is why so many attempts at relating to the dead fail. They are not rooted in love, or when they are rooted in love, because they are seeking some functional benefit for the living party. When the relationship with a particular post-mortal being is sought as a properly loving attitude, in order to participate not use, for itself rather than to achieve something, then it is, surely, much more likely genuinely to be achieved, will very probably be wholesome, and may be relied upon as valid and real. Note, this is why I think it better not to be too eager to share one's own specific experiences of contact, of friendship, with the dead. Such claims may easily become status claims, or else their validity may be challenged, leading to a defensive and argumentative assertion. The Saruman syndrome and AI-dolatry. Bruce Charlton. The Saruman syndrome happens when the lust to be a winner, or the horror of being a loser, causes people to switch sides from good to evil, themselves to join with the side of evil, as soon as they become convinced that the side of evil is going to prevail.
Saruman drew himself up then and began to declaim, as if he were making a speech long rehearsed. The elder days are gone. The middle days are passing. The younger days are beginning. The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand, the world of men, which we must rule. But we must have power to order all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see. And listen, Gandalf, my old friend and helper, he said, coming near and speaking now in a softer voice. I said we, for we it may be, if you will join with me. A new power is rising. Against it the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. This then is one choice before you, before us. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. From the Council of Elrond, in the Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien.
The Saruman syndrome, or, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. The unprecedented quantities of money and resources being extracted from the productive economy, and redirected into the global totalitarian AI project, makes AI-dolatry a very tempting, almost irresistible, motivation to a certain type of person. Some people, very obviously, have a horror of being regarded as a loser, of losing power/status/wealth, of being regarded as stupid for backing the wrong horse. And of course, a switch over to join the apparently winning side brings immediate, upfront, this worldly benefits. So, why not? The only problem is to justify, to yourself and others, this switch to evil, by calling it good. The only obstacle blocking the path of grabbing for a share of AI bounty, by joining the side of demonic strategic evil, is in justifying this lapse into short-termist selfishness by self-deceptive and publicly dishonest arguments. However, for some people such self-justification is not so much a barrier as a challenge.
Saruman, as the power grows, its proved friends will also grow, and the wise, such as you and I, may with patience come at last to direct its courses, to control it. We can bide our time, we can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose, knowledge, rule, order, all the things that we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak or idle friends. There would not be, any real change in our designs, only in our means.
The motivations for AI-dolatry are therefore easily understandable, very commonplace, and absolutely culturally mainstream here and now. The motives are to do with gaining and retaining power, status, and wealth, the overwhelmingly major motivations in our atheistic, materialistic, hedonic/therapeutic society of late Western civilization. They are the same motivations that led a large majority of managers, professionals and intellectuals publicly to embrace, as required, socialism, feminism, anti-racism, climate zealotry, the sexual revolution, and whatever else is currently being pushed by the totalitarian establishment, the birdemic, the PEC, anti-Fire Nation psychosis, and now AI-dolatry. The fact that some person resisted wave after wave of previous temptations to align with the side of evil, does not mean they are forever immune to succumbing to embracing later strategies. Maybe this new scheme presses the right buttons, that earlier schemes did not. There are indeed many possible reasons for the Saruman syndrome. People get greedy and impatient for what they regard as success. They may grow afraid, or sense themselves being incipiently overwhelmed by despair. They may feel themselves teeter on the cusp of a collapse of power/status/wealth unless they ride the big new wave, or jump onto the gravy train of this latest establishment strategy. And so they apostatize from God, divine creation, the soul, and salvation, jump ship onto the side ranged against these, declare themselves for the side aiming at subversion, destruction, and inversion of the good. And they tell themselves and others, there need not be, there would not be, any real change in our designs, only in our means. So there we have it, the Saruman syndrome. Note, I got the idea for this when commenting at Francis Berger's blog. We live in a world shaped and dictated by invisible subsidies. Bruce Charlton. In the old days, a king would grant a favored vassal a legal monopoly on the provision of some sort of goods or services, but nowadays the rulers inject invisible subsidies, at the early stages and for many years, to ensure the success of those corporations that they wish to establish as a part of the totalitarian system. These vast subsidies are concealed by fairy tales about how Megacorp were founded by a ragtag band of eccentric college dropouts who had a bright idea, working from their mum's front parlor. They then launched some tiny startup that, somehow, made no money for many years, yet, somehow, managed to expand more and more, recruit more and more people, and, because their service was so incredibly cheap, or, amazingly, provided free at point of use. And eventually these supposed genius slackers, somehow, ended up with a large majority market share in an enormous new business. At which point they, suddenly, become one of the biggest, wealthiest, most powerful corporations in the history of the world, and dictate to nation-states and international organizations alike. Such is the immense power of invisible subsidy. The magic of big money in overcoming common sense. Bruce Charlton. The biggest frauds of recent decades have all involved big money overcoming common sense. Enough big money and, it is clear, people will believe what they know to be impossible. Indeed, they are positively eager and zealous to believe what they know to be impossible. A clear and uncontroversial example is the Theranos fraud. I watched a speech by the alleged CEO, but possibly just a puppet front, claiming they would develop a way of removing blood from veins without breaking the skin. This is obviously impossible, but most of the talk was about what enormous advantages there would be from such a breakthrough, how marvelous it would be if you could get blood out from blood vessels without needing to make a hole. The reported fact that so many people invested loads of money into this scheme, albeit mostly other people's money, plus liberal helpings of pseudoscientific gobbledygook, made people overcome what was obvious common sense, and assume that the impossible was actually possible. But Theranos was a negligible sideshow, one country and hundreds of millions of dollars, compared with the global fraud of hundreds of trillions due to the CO2 climate scam, and the AI scam. Both actually occult parasitic totalitarian social engineering. Yet, if it wasn't for the mind-distorting effect of gigadollar money, and the vast forces of personnel and propaganda that it buys, both the CO2 climate and AI claims would have very obviously failed the test of common sense. But when it comes to climate and AI, the bigness of the money combines with the bigness of the claims stuns people into a passive state of bewildered and gullible acceptance, i.e. a species of SOP. Surely, people infer, they couldn't be making such unimaginably, indeed unbelievably, immense claims, if there was not a solid basis for them. Well, yes, they have done, can, and still do exactly that, and indeed the process has become routine. Business as usual. Enough money and resources, and people will believe anything. Why is the Western intellectual class, managerial, professional etc., the most deeply corrupted? Bruce Charlton. It has become pretty obvious that the class of which I am a member, the upper middle class, the people who work in professional and managerial jobs, nowadays, mostly as bureaucrats, of one sort or another, are the most corrupted of people in the West. I mean the most corrupted, that is the most mentally converged with the evil ruling ideology of atheist materialism, therefore and de facto leftism, whatever its self-identification. The leadership class use the ideology for their own personal, and at the highest levels, evil/spiritual/strategic, ends, but it is the intellectual class who believe the ideology, who live by it, and who are convinced that living by the ideology is righteous. Why should this be? I think there are two main reasons that are worth attention. The first is that the intellectual class are profoundly unspiritual, unreligious. They have internalized that there is no life, their personal souls, their unique selves, beyond death, and that there is no purpose to their own individual human life, and that their individual life has no objective meaning for the totality of reality. So, these people are seriously demotivated. They do not have any genuine, and primary reason or quest or job to do in their own life. Consequently, they look outside themselves to be motivated, they seek out with their own personal evaluations to be told what to think and do, how to evaluate and behave. Because they have nothing they deeply desire to do, from themselves, they have no reason seriously to resist, let alone oppose, external influences. They are prone to regard external influences fatalistically, as absolute, and inevitable, even when they are not. But when external influences are genuinely overwhelming, this is seized upon a decisive reason to join with them, motivationally as well as obediently, mentally as well as physically. This relates to, and is reinforced by, a stubborn and profound desire to avoid personal responsibility. This refusal of responsibility is extraordinarily strong, and individuals will go to extreme lengths to assert their own powerlessness, their own status as passive victim, and will become extremely passionate on the subject. Non-responsibility of the individual, ultimately of myself in the situation of this mortal life, has something of the status of religious dogma among the Western intellectual class. It is not just an excuse, but a righteous conviction. Any person who does not share this dogma of the ideal of non-responsibility is regarded as ignorant, and deserving of exclusion, or insanely deranged if he persists in non-compliance. And someone who defends the primacy of his own inner motivation on the basis of taking responsibility for their own mortal lives, is perceived as dangerous, and probably evil. In respect to demotivation and denial of responsibility, professed religion or spirituality appears to make an insignificant difference, yet the actuality of a primarily motivating belief in Christianity combined with a responsible personal engagement would appear to be the only way out from the systemic self-corruption of the intellectual class. The inner reality of a personally engaged Christianity would seem to be necessary, albeit that its public profession is neither here nor there. This was my experience before I became a Christian. I was highly inwardly motivated to pursue what I considered to be the highest path I could envisage, and I took responsibility for doing so. Yet I could not explain or justify this to others, nor even to myself, because officially my metaphysical assumptions were those of atheistic materialism. By my innate nature, I was compelled to make life difficult for myself and be a nuisance to those around me, but while I intuitively felt this was actually good, this hardly conscious intuition was refuted by my conscious and explicit beliefs. And such contradictions in myself weakened motivation, and sometimes rendered it vulnerable to the drip-drip of societal pressure, so I would recurrently slip into self-justified conformist expediency, until rescued by my own intractable personality. The reasons why publicly professed Christianity is nigh irrelevant are obvious enough. When a Christian's righteousness is externally motivated, he will lack the needful inner motivation to eschew and strong exposure to corruption, which is everywhere, and when he sees righteousness as entailing surrender of responsibility to any external entity, he will become subject to the endemic, all-pervasive, increasing corruption of Western totalitarianism, as a matter of religious principle. Among this class, self-identification as religious is just a lifestyle choice. Religion makes no significant difference to their fundamental convictions or bottom-line behaviors, which are ideological. Ideology comes first, their religion is fitted into their ideology. When the one becomes two. William Wildblood. In May of 2024 I published on this blog a short series of excerpts from Coleridge's Table Talk, which is a collection of his conversations with friends round the dinner table recorded for posterity. One of them ran like this. "Most women have no character at all," said Pope, and meant it for satire. Shakespeare, who knew man and woman much better, saw that it, in fact, was the perfection of woman to be characterless. Everyone wishes a Desdemona or Ophelia for a wife, creatures who, though they may not always understand you, do always feel you, and feel with you. I added a brief commentary saying that if the highest state of matter is to reflect spirit perfectly, you can see what he means here. This extended Coleridge's insight to the metaphysical plane, but that is the only place the solution to the war between the sexes can be found, because it is here that the division into two poles of being first takes place. This is where it works as it should. The modern version of female rebellion against the male dates back to the early 19th century. It might be seen as a consequence of masculine leadership, backed by all order-based religion, tipping over into tyranny, or else of man's prior rebellion against God. However, the reality is that it goes much further back to the Garden of Eden. It is nothing new, and though it may be provoked by male oppression, that is not the cause of it. The basic cause is female ego, which is not to say that male ego is not involved in the sex war, for it surely is, but that is not the primary reason for seeking to overturn an order ordained by God from the beginning. Men have certainly abused that order, though, ironically, less so in the culture in which the modern rebellion arose than practically all others, but that does not make the order itself invalid. With that in mind, let us consider the following. Premise: the feminine can only blossom and flourish when it submits to the leadership of the masculine. Societies can only blossom and flourish spiritually when this is the case. Proviso: this leadership must be a loving one, or authority becomes authoritarian. Qualifier: this does not mean women must submit to men at all times, for there are certainly areas in which women should take the lead and men should follow. Nonetheless, in overall terms, the feminine should submit to the masculine if order is to be maintained, just as in the broader sense a man's soul should submit to God, all souls being feminine to God, feminine soul, masculine spirit. First principles: in terms of absolute reality, the masculine force relates to being and the feminine to becoming and change. In terms of manifestation, the masculine or active force acts and the feminine or passive reacts. The feminine principle is subordinate to the masculine principle, though both are parts of one coexisting whole. You can say they are spiritually equal if you understand that in the context of their differing functions in a hierarchy of being. In the real world there will inevitably be permutations and variations depending on individuals and their circumstances, but underlying these there must always be cognizance and acceptance of the basic form if society is to function as it should and men and women to realize their proper spiritual purpose. Dion Fortune was told this by one of her masters as related in the cosmic doctrine. You will be given certain images, which are not descriptive but symbolic, and are designed to train the mind not to inform it. Therefore, you may think of the unmanifest as interstellar space, and of the logos as a sun surrounded by its solar system of planets, and of the emanations of the logos as rays. The unmanifest is the only unity. Manifestation begins when duality occurs. He goes on to say that the prime duality is space and movement. That is one way of putting it. There are others. For instance, movement is time. Space is darkness. Movement is, or is akin to, light. This is the root of male and female, and it goes back to the beginning of things. Here you will see that the male acts on the female who is passive as is space. God moving on the face of the waters. The mystery of time and space is the mystery of masculine and feminine. Space is all potential, but it waits to be fecundated. Time, which is movement, fecundates. Only when we understand metaphysics will we understand the mystery of the two sexes, and to do this we must detach ourselves from an exclusive association of sex with its expression in human beings. That must be seen in the light of metaphysical principles which are the realities behind it. In fact, the unmanifest is not interstellar space which only comes about when the unmanifest manifests, but this is the best image the human mind, based on forms, can grasp. The re-enchantment of the world, a matter of direct spiritual contacts. Bruce Charlton. Since the emergence of Romanticism in the late 1700s, the disenchantment of our modern world has been a constant cultural theme, and there have been many analyses of its cause, and suggestions concerning the possibilities for re-enchantment. I have, over the past half-century, read many books and essays on this theme, and I observe that more continue to be published. In recent years I have expanded my explorations to include the tradition of Christian ceremonial magic, in particular the works of Dion Fortune and Gareth Knight. Knight, in particular, confronts this issue head-on, especially in his autobiography I Called It Magic, 2011, which describes the, almost, lifelong quest for re-enchantment of his life. What follows derives from such considerations, and takes the form of notes to myself, as a kind of aid memoir concerning a partial crystallization of ideas. In our world, here and now, the proper aim of magical activity is to establish the greatest possible range of loving contacts. By which I mean, in particular, direct interbeing contacts of a spiritual kind. By direct contacts I mean mind to mind, therefore unmediated, not perceptual, not symbolic nor linguistic. By beings I mean any of the primary units of reality, because I regard reality as consisting of eternally existing and developing beings that are alive, purposive, and, to some extent, conscious. Therefore, re-enchantment is not about abstractions or atmospheres, nor particular qualities of consciousness or thinking. Re-enchantment is concrete and specific, like the interpersonal relationships with those we love. Re-enchantment is about an expanded awareness of and interaction with many beings of many kinds, and especially awareness of those entities that are, by mainstream modern ideas and ideologies, considered to be imaginary, not to exist, to be unalive/dead, or not to be beings/never alive. Re-enchantment is piecemeal and quantitative, because expanded awareness could include so many contacts with so many beings of so many kinds. Here is an incomplete list of the kind of contacts that constitute re-enchantment. Telepathy with living human beings. So-called dead people, resurrected men. Premortal spirit humans. Animals, plants, and mineral beings. Nature spirits. Fairies. Divine beings, including the Holy Ghost. Planets and stars. The scope of magical contacts is as wide as the nature of beings. To simplify somewhat, these contacts are what is missing from the alienated, materialistic and mundane life of modern men, and a person who lived in continuous contact with all these kinds of beings, and other beings, would be living the enchanted life. But more needs to be said, and that includes that the contacts be of the right quality, which is to say loving. The point is not, as so often has been sought, to make contact with beings in order to use them to seek power/wealth/sex/status, nor to get information from them, nor to be healed by them, nor to get guidance from them. If other beings are regarded as means to an end, any relationship will be disenchanted. An enchanted relationship cannot be instrumental. The point of these contacts is the value of loving relationships in and of themselves. The point of these contacts is expanded awareness. However, contacts are not static nor merely contemplative, because contacts are two-way, they are dynamic, developmental. Beings in a loving relationship therefore aspire to active relationship. The interaction of beings, their mutual influencing, is the context of creativity. Creation, for an individual, is actively participating in the web of his relationships. By this activity he makes a difference to divine creation. In sum, contemplation is a passive participation in relationships on one side, however, creativity is active participation on both sides. Re-enchanting the world is thus about restoring and gaining the fullest range of contacts. And, for the seeking of loving contacts to be a meaningful activity in our actual lives, not to be regarded as trivial, nor explained away in materialistic terms, we need to be able to explain to ourselves how this really happens, and why it is really significant in terms of eternal creation. How to deal with the infinite and expanding quantity of disinformation. Bruce Charlton. Disinformation is deliberately wrong information, and it is a far more significant problem, here and now, than either censorship or information deliberately designed to manipulate in a particular direction. The phenomenon has been growing for several generations to a vast size. But the post-November 2022 AI phenomenon is a case in point. AI is now not only the source of a qualitatively increased volume of disinformation, but AI, its nature and scope, is itself the subject of a massive and sustained campaign of disinformation. How should we deal with the fact that nearly half of what is said by and about everything significant, such as AI, climate, geopolitics, race, health, is deliberately wrong, and that there is such an incredible quantity of this wrongness? From an individual's perspective, disinformation is already infinite and still increasing. It is nonsense to say we should trust only trustworthy sources, because in the ocean of disinformation we cannot discern these, and even honest and competent sources are themselves fed by a great deal of disinformation. Therefore, so far as we can know, there are zero trustworthy sources. The answer is that we first need to accept the reality of the situation. We need to bypass the whole ever-expanding edifice of deliberate falseness, and decide what is what for ourselves and from our direct knowledge and intuition. And we, therefore, need to accept that our own judgment on things cannot be publicly justified by arguing from a basis of common evidential ground. We cannot argue using publicly available information of accepted validity. We must, therefore, be contented with our own judgment, for our own purposes. This does not mean we need to keep our judgment private, but that in making our inferences explicit we should not expect to succeed in persuading those others who are accepting the truth of one or another set of deliberate lies. If we are atheist materialists, this is a counsel of despair, it is a black pill. But if we are a romantic Christian, who believes in the primacy of the spiritual and God as creator, then we are convinced that our own personal knowledge of and adherence to truth has a direct and positive effect on total reality, by its incorporation into ongoing divine creation. And that ought to be enough. People don't want, and anyway can't do, the past, so it's not an option, despite that the present really is worse. Bruce Charlton. It is a big problem, that has been ongoing and increasing for something like 250 years, that more and more people have stopped wanting the past, and, even those that do want it in theory and as an ideal, cannot actually do it. This is the case for Christianity, in all its types, and it is the case in every area of culture of which I am aware. Modern Christianity is much worse than the past, but there are never enough people to prevent the present, and those who want the past don't want it enough, or else, when push comes to shove, can't actually do essential bits of it. Modern pseudo-Christianity takes over, and dies, but the traditionalists shrink, are overwhelmed by politics and infighting, and yet become more theoretically extreme and hardline in their fantasies and aspiration of how things could be if only. The present is rubbish, yet the past has no traction. Same in classical, and no even popular, music, the same in politics and government, science, medicine, law, education, journalism, the police and military. The same everywhere. The same in marriage and the family. All significant changes in all domains of living turn out to be net destructive, yet the good stuff somehow is not preserved, because somehow people don't want it enough. Or can't justify why they want it, or they want it but cannot actually live it when the chips are down. Therefore, whatever the future holds, it is neither going to be a recurrence of the past nor a continuation of the self-annihilating present. We can of course, and nearly everybody does, be either reactionaries or radicals, but both are futile. Reaction is futile because of the above, but radicalism is futile because it continually destroys itself, and leads only towards a situation of chaos that only demons and their mind-controlled puppets would actually desire. Yet, here we are, you and me. We can be sure that we all have potential access to salvation and the guidance and sustenance of the Holy Ghost, else we would not be here in the first place, and in our actual lives have experiences and lessons that are potentially of great value for eternity, else we would not be sustained alive. So, although I see no grounds for optimism in societal terms, there is every reason for hope in personal terms. Merely religious-themed fandom, the Christian Church is here and now. Bruce Charlton. I was reflecting on the fate of the New Age spirituality, which began in the late 70s but hit public consciousness from the middling 1980s. There was a tremendous growth in this loose movement, involving huge numbers of people, thousands of whom were professionals, made a living from it, thousands of book titles, with sections in mainstream bookshops and multiple specialized bookshops, a huge expansion of participation in workshops, conferences, residential weekends, pilgrimages and the like. It seemed to most people at the time that this was evidence of an ongoing mass spiritual transformation, which would lead to a much more spiritual and personal, less materialistic and bureaucratic world. And yet here we are. Masses of people spend many hours per day interacting with the internet and social media. A world where small-scale institutions are subordinated or co-opted or assimilated to the agenda of globalist or multinational institutions, a world where all the crafts, guilds or professions of 1980 are now either destroyed or converged into a depersonalized, increasingly computer-mediated, totalitarian bureaucracy. What we got instead of spiritual transformation was spiritually themed fandom, which is simply a component part of the system, an aspect of the leisure industry. And almost exactly the same has happened to the churches. Whatever hopes may have been cherished for a positively transformative religious revival, a church-based Christian revival, have devolved into merely religious-themed fandom. To be a devout Christian church person is nowadays a part of the leisure industry, and implicitly regarded as such, as was evident in 2020 when the churches formally acknowledged themselves to be, unlike gardening shops, for example, a part of the non-essential economy, and therefore collaborated eagerly in their own closure. The churches offer a variety of leisure time and sociable activities, and the really keen Christian will spend hours a day getting updates and inspiring Christian quotes from social media, reading and commenting on Christian social media and, if serious Christians, various essays and blogs, and during their holidays can make Christian pilgrimages, and post photos of their Christian devotion onto their favored media. Really serious Christians can be internet creators, generating their own visual and audio material to stimulate others, and perhaps gathering a bit of extra income from running advertisements, getting sponsorship, amassing a band of admiring virtual patrons, or facilitating drive-by consumers to buy them a virtual cup of coffee. Christian church activity is nowadays just like any other leisure activity, except that it about Christianity, has a Christian-themed content, instead of being about movies, popular TV series, bestsellers, celebrities, or sports teams and stars. Such activity is precisely analogous to, no deeper than, no more religiously significant than, any of the many other fandoms of sports, franchise products, hobbies and pastimes, special interest groups and charities, with which the mass/social media abounds. As with New Age, this kind of religious growth may be enjoyable, else people wouldn't do it, but it has demonstrably feeble religious depth or motivational power, because the whole activity is encapsulated within the ruling mainstream totalitarian and materialist ideology. Christian churches here and now are just a subtype of system-assimilated fandom, and have no more spiritual significance than any other such.